You may have heard of hit recording artist Chapel Roan, but have you heard of Roan Mountain State Park? I hadn't. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. It was just after noon on July 2nd, 1983, when 30-year-old Patricia Reel reported that her son, 8-year-old Michael Eugene Reel, had vanished from their campsite near Twin Springs picnic area in Roan Mountain State Park, a mile north of the Appalachian Trail. Usually, I'd be able to start a video by telling you very simply how things developed from there, but in this case, things are not so simple. You see, newspaper articles that discussed this case back when it happened couldn't seem to agree exactly how and when Michael Reel disappeared, nor who was present when it happened. An article published on Monday, July 4th, 1983, paraphrases Carter County, Tennessee Deputy Sheriff Joe Valentine as saying that when the mother awoke Saturday morning, the boy was missing. According to Valentine, the missing persons report was made at 12:18 p.m., with the article adding, Michael apparently wandered off from the campsite either late Friday night or early Saturday morning. That campsite, according to the Bristol Herald-Courier issue on the 5th of July, was shared by mother and son, as well as grandmother Margaret English and 4 of Michael's sisters. As for why Michael's father, Ernie, was not on the camping trip, it was reported that Ernie and Patricia were separated. However, things quickly get weird about this whole case because the Herald-Courier did not totally agree with the Durham Star, reporting that Patricia and Margaret said he was shooting a BB gun and he was going down the road looking for BB shots and got lost. This was echoed by the Johnson City Press, which reported that he was last seen walking upstate Route 143 carrying a small pot. In addition to that, the Elizabethton Star would publish an article on the 6th, which, while not saying directly who was there, suggested that Margaret English's husband, Jimmy English, was there that day as well. The article stated that according to the police, on the morning Michael had disappeared, he was helping his grandfather carry utensils to the picnic ground across the street from his family's campsite when he dropped some BBs from a gun he was carrying and stopped to pick them up. To be clear, both of Michael's biological grandfathers had passed away. Jimmy was his step-grandfather. Anyway, Michael disappearing at a specific time of day rather than sometime during the night is supported by reporting from the Kingsport Times, which included in their article from the 3rd that Michael had vanished around 11:30 a.m. It's hard to say for sure what caused all of these differences in reporting and if they had any bearing on the eventual outcome of the case. That said, it is something to keep in the back of your mind as we progress throughout the rest of this story. This is one of those rare cases where even after compiling all of the evidence that I could find, reading through all of it, doing the notes, and really analyzing everything, I still have to wonder if something less than mundane happened to the missing person, because this one just does not make sense. But you know what does make sense? Keeping your personal information off of the internet. And that's why I'd like to introduce our partner for today's video, Delete Me. Have you ever Googled yourself or Googled something like, your name, address, your name, phone number? If you have, there's a good chance that if you've put any of that information into any form anywhere on the internet, your information has wound up on a data broker site. I can tell you from experience that when I worked in marketing, I would have sheets of names, phone numbers, addresses just dropped on my desk, and I would be told, hey, send these people advertisements. Where did the people giving me those sheets of information get the sheets of information? Well, they got it from you filling out a form on the internet. Sometimes it would be something that made sense. I worked in health insurance marketing, so people would fill out a form on one of our websites that gave us the information they had and told us they were looking for Medicare coverage. But that's not how it always goes. Sometimes you go to sign up for a free trial, or you want to take a little IQ test online or something like that. And then your information ends up just out there in the world. There's an old saying in social media marketing that if the product is free, you are the product. The point is, if you've ever filled out a form on the internet, there is a good chance that your personal information is being bought and sold. That can definitely be annoying because you're going to get scam calls, spam emails, text messages with, scams in them, things like that. But it can also be a more serious issue if somebody is stalking you, for instance. If you weren't aware, data brokers do not care about you, they just care about money, so they will sell your personal information to anyone and everyone who will pay them for it. Our sponsor for today's video, Delete Me, exists to make your information less accessible. The way that it works is that when you sign up, you give them the information that you don't want appearing on these brokerage sites. Delete Me will then scan its database of brokerage sites and file takedown requests for your information wherever it is found. And because sites like this only have to take down the information when it's requested, your information tends to end up there again. So Delete Me continuously scans and continuously files removal requests on your behalf. As an internet user, there is no way to make yourself completely anonymous, but Delete Me provides a very good shield to keep you as safe as possible. If you'd like to give Delete Me a try, you can go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use code LORELODGE at checkout to get 20% off all US consumer plans. Once again, that is joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use the code LORELODGE at checkout to get 20% off all US consumer plans. Whatever the details of Michael's disappearance were, the search began in the immediate vicinity of his campsite, where his family found his BB gun leaning against his bed in the family's camper, according to the Elizabethton Star. And actually, in this instance, Elizabethton is the nearest major town and newspaper to this case. Details of this paper are pretty scant in the reporting, and I could not find any of the police or State Park Service records. But what we do know is that the official effort lasted until 9 p.m. that evening, with REACT teams spending the night in the park so that they could continue looking for the boy. REACT stands for Radio Emergency Associated Communication Teams, which are volunteer groups that can be made up of things like off-duty law enforcement officers, mountain rescue squads, and other search and rescue groups. According to Deputy Joe Valentine, they began the search in the Twin Springs area, and from there the search area grew wider and wider, which is typically how this goes. You usually start with the person's last known location and spread out from there. On Sunday the 3rd, several reports came in from tourists in the area claiming that they had seen the boy, though this was in an area that was 3 to 4 miles from where Michael was last seen by his family. Park Superintendent Glenn Hatfield told the Elizabethton Star that one of the tourists said they had seen a little boy in the gardens on the very top of the mountain on the North Carolina-Tennessee state line yesterday, placing the boy southwest of his camp. The search quickly refocused to the vicinity of the rhododendron gardens atop the mountain, where the Chapel Hill News reported that at least 3 people claimed to have seen him darting in and out of the knotted rhododendron bushes on the 6,285-foot tall peak. For those of you not on the Freedom Unit system, that's about 1,915 meters. At that point, dogs were dispatched to the area, according to Avery County Sheriff's dispatcher Mark Phillips, who added that he just won't come to the people who see him. Evidently, he's pretty scared. Amongst the volunteers headed up to that location was Michael's father, Ernie Reel, who, as I previously mentioned, was not present for this trip because he and the mother were estranged. But as Ernie called out for his son, 2 policemen heard a child yell either "I'm coming out, Dad," or "I'm not coming out, Dad," according to Carter County Chief Deputy Mike Sellers. While searchers remained optimistic that the boy was alive because he had been spotted and heard, according to the Bristol Herald-Courier, officials said time might be running out. Sheriff Sergeant Doug Jennings put it pretty bluntly, telling the paper that if he stays out there much longer, he'll suffer, as Michael had no food and water with him. Given the number of creeks and small streams that wind their way through the Great Smoky Mountains, water was less of a concern, and that led to some very interesting tactics. What I mean by that is that on Sunday night, after Ernie Reel was unable to coax his son out of the rhododendron bushes, Chief Deputy Sellers left food out for the boy on the picnic tables in the garden, according to the Elizabeth Star. The next morning, upon returning to the site, Sellers found that a hot dog was found chewed and spit out, and a Little Debbie oatmeal cake was missing, but the only other sign of Michael was a bed of ferns underneath the table. That bed of ferns itself was pretty important, because it would have suggested that Michael might have spent the night under that table, and in doing so could have found some shelter from the thunderstorm that washed over the mountain that evening. Had he become soaked during that storm, it could have exacerbated the already chilly conditions during the night up on top of the mountain. Even during the day, it was only around 60 degrees Fahrenheit at the base of the mountain, that's 15 degrees Celsius by the way, with temperatures falling into the 40s at night and the mountain's top itself being several degrees cooler. And all of this made hypothermia a very real concern, despite it being July. Still, Michael had only been gone for 2 nights, and the area that he was in was pretty well traveled and accessible via a paved road, so there was really no reason to believe that he couldn't have survived to that point. Searchers continued to concentrate on the rhododendron gardens on Monday, but again, there are very few details as to what that search entailed, aside from the early termination that day due to worsening weather conditions. By the end of the day on Tuesday, July 5th, hope of finding Michael alive was fading fast, and not just because of the weather. According to Sergeant Jennings, at this point the search had covered about 10 square miles without finding a single trace of Michael's whereabouts. Despite the participation of hundreds of volunteers and at least 100 professionals, all they had to go on was his initial position, the sightings at the rhododendron gardens, and a report of a boy with a bowl walking along Highway 261. That boy matched the description. That description, by the way, was that he was a 4-foot-tall, 8-year-old blonde boy. I can't remember the weight off the top of my head, and I didn't write it down because I am a fool, but he was skinny. So, with nothing further coming in on Tuesday, aside from a trail of prints that were deemed too old to belong to Michael, the Elizabethton Star reported that Superintendent Hatfield was suspending the organized search. The area has been combed thoroughly on foot, Hatfield said. The massive search is over now. If any good evidence comes up, like a shoe, a piece of shirt, then the search will become massive again. By this point, the Reel family, as well as a number of volunteers and even some officials, were of the belief that Michael was picked up and driven up the mountain. Or possibly he was even kidnapped and taken out of the park entirely. Patricia Reel told the Elizabethton Star that she really believed somebody had picked him up because he always stayed close to her and wouldn't even go outside to play without asking. The wording there suggests foul play, and officials were of a similar mindset. Sheriff Crumley telling reporters that a missing persons report was sent nationwide and officers were exploring the possibility of an abduction. Sellers echoed this, saying that a lot of people have speculated that he was abducted, which he felt was a possibility, a good probability. And Sheriff Bill Crumley went so far as to say, if in fact he was abducted, he'd probably be in a better state of health than he would be in this kind of environment, as exposure was a ticking clock. Whatever the case, the limited resources of the Sheriff's Department and the park staff meant that this investigation couldn't really go on any longer without outside assistance. But they were willing to accept that help from just about anywhere. On Thursday the 7th, the Elizabethton Star published an article entitled, "Searchers Check Out Psychic Information," reporting that officials were following up on psychic leads, though they had been to that point fruitless. That day, searchers were sent out to the crags and cliffs of Wolf Ridge after a psychic from Missouri described seeing the boy in an area resembling that landmark. Unfortunately, this search turned up nothing, and while officials were careful not to insult those trying to help from that community, they seemed markedly more grateful for the arrival of about 40 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne based out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Requested by Carter County Sheriff Bill Crumley, the Army's assistance and another swell of volunteer groups allowed the search to ramp right back up, with soldiers using night vision goggles in order to continue in the dark. I would quickly like to address the fact that some versions of this story that you find online and in print will tell you that the Green Berets were there. I've seen as high a number as 140 Green Berets. I don't think that's accurate. I found one contemporary report that mentioned Green Berets, but not in that number. It was 40 Green Berets and then 100 other professional searchers. But the vast majority of articles from the time are very clear that these were paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne. I am curious, by the way, if any of you have relatives who were in the 82nd Airborne or stationed at Fort Bragg in 1983, if you don't mind asking them about this search and if they know anything, I'd be curious to know what their involvement was like and what opinions they had. When we have cases like this where the military gets involved in some capacity, what they felt, what they thought, and in some cases why they were there, aside from just being requested, is the hardest information to find. So anytime people can provide us with even an anecdote about what it was like to be there, what somebody was thinking on the ground, we really appreciate that. Unfortunately, in this case, even with the help of the military and that new swell of volunteers, progress was extremely limited, and by Friday the 8th, no meaningful progress had been made. If Michael was still in the park, he was probably deceased, but they were willing to give it one more day. By the morning of Saturday, July 10th, 1983, those involved with the search for Michael Reel were ready to accept defeat. So one can imagine the surprise on the faces of several rescue squadmen when they stumbled right into the boy, very much alive and well. "We were walking along a cow path looking from side to side and he just yelled at us," Steve Hopkins told the Elizabethton Star, after he, Taylor Bailey, and Jimmy Doyle found the boy on a farm off Heaton Ridge Road at around 9:30 a.m. He was still carrying the little camping pot bowl thing that he had with him when he left camp, nestled in the brush some 2 miles north of where he was last seen. Michael attempted to walk back to the road with the rescuers, but was a little too weak to do so, so they carried him piggyback style back to the road, at which point he was loaded into an ambulance and taken to Carter County Memorial Hospital. There, he was examined by medical staff, and they determined that after spending 7 days in the woods, suffering through thunderstorms, and with only berries and apples to eat, Michael Reel was given a clean bill of health by Dr. Dennis Logg, who told reporters it's a miracle he's alive. The boy had shed 8 pounds, was covered in mosquito and chigger bites, and had some skinned knees, but aside from the insect bites, a few scratches, and the weakness from lack of food, Logg continued, he's in good health. Michael was quick to start putting the pounds back on, hospital spokesman Jack Hughes saying he wanted lots of Cheetos, potato chips, and candy bars. He couldn't eat much at once, but he ate a lot over a period. According to the Montgomery Advisor, the 8-year-old ate a belly full of hamburger on the drive home and had said, "I couldn't finish it all, but it was better than eating them crab apples." And I included that quote from Michael for a specific reason, because there's a few other quotes he gives to various papers, like, "I just want to forget about it, I'm going swimming tomorrow." Michael seems like he was pretty aware. Like, this is not a small child. It's a kid, but it's not a toddler. He had some awareness of the situation in which he had been, and he was able to coherently describe it to adults. Of his time in the woods, Michael told his mother that he'd eaten berries and wild apples during his ordeal, and that at night he'd curl up in a ball and sleep under a tree. Deputy Sellers was quoted as saying, "He's a tough kid. He told me the rain didn't bother him," continuing to say, "I'd given up on the boy last Tuesday," and that he expected if they found him, he would not be found alive. But while Michael's physical state was surprisingly good, his mental condition was a little bit more up in the air, with doctors questioning certain aspects of the tales told by this child. On Monday the 11th, the Elizabethton Star reported that the boy's piecemeal accounts of being alone on the rhododendron-covered mountaintop was laced with inconsistencies, some of which doctors wrote off as hallucinations. While the article in the Star did not give details, the Johnson City Press did on the 10th, in an article entitled "Child Confused, Healthy After Rescue." According to rescuer Jimmy Doyle, they were about 30 feet into the woods off a field when Michael simply called out, "Hey!" And when asked what his name was, he told them it was Michael. They said, "Michael what?" He said, "Michael Reel." They went, "Oh my God." Doyle said that they asked the child, whose hair looked clean and well-groomed, by the way, how long he'd been out there in the forest, and he calmly responded, "Oh, about 30 minutes. And if you think that that's the weirdest thing about this story, you would be wrong. Michael reportedly told Doyle that he had been staying with his grandfather in a little white house, watching television and eating eggs and biscuits for breakfast, and drinking milk and orange juice. The article continued, adding that he also told rescuers that his family had been bringing him food, all of which was chalked up to confusion derived from hypothermia. Now, Michael being cold was understandable, but what struck Doyle and the others as somewhat odd was how the boy appeared to get colder as they neared the road, which was beyond a couple of hills from where he was found. While certainly strange, that was not the only important aspect of this article. Remember how at the very beginning of this video I said that exactly how Michael disappeared and precisely who was there when it happened was in question? Well, according to Chief Deputy Sellers, Michael told him that he walked to a stream to get water for his mother's coffee and had become lost, while the initial reporting was entirely different. Looking back at articles from the first few days of the search, we were told that Michael could have disappeared late Friday night, implying that he was last seen by his mother the evening prior. Of course, his mother was not the only one there either, the Bristol Herald-Courier reporting that his grandmother, as well as 4 sisters, were also there at the campsite. Then, in the Elizabethton Star's July 6 issue, it was claimed that Michael was helping his grandfather carry supplies from the campsite down to the picnic area when he stopped to pick up some BBs. This itself conflicts somewhat with the Herald-Courier's claim that he was shooting a BB gun and went to collect the ammunition, but disappeared while doing that. Meanwhile, yet another article in the Hickory Daily Record, the Reel family's hometown newspaper, stated the child's mother, Patricia Reel, said her son had returned to the family car to get BBs for his BB gun. According to that article, she added that he was carrying a coffee pot and it hadn't been 5 minutes and he was gone. Perhaps these inconsistencies can be dismissed as poor reporting by the journalists involved, but I think it's important to keep open the possibility that they are the result of people telling different stories to different reporters. Either way, as the Johnson City Press gave the details of what Michael said he'd experienced out there, the Knoxville News-Sentinel covered the official explanation for how Michael got from the campsite to where he was ultimately found. Chief Deputy Sellers traced Michael's path during the week after speaking with him Saturday afternoon, and he came up with a pretty simple narrative. He basically followed the stream from their campsite at the base of the mountain, and that goes with several reports we had of footprints down in that area. Though, as we said, those footprints had been dismissed as too old. Simple as that all may sound, the same article noted that Michael was found less than an hour after Doyle and Hopkins entered the forest in an area searchers had concentrated on throughout the week. This is to the extent that Chief Deputy Sellers told the papers that he had a lot of guys swearing they had searched that area 3 or 4 times, while searcher Leonard Peters said with those laurel thickets and chest-high weeds, you could walk by and never see him. So, with all of the loose ends seemingly covered by the dense terrain and hypothermia-induced hallucinations, Sheriff Crumley closed the case on July 12th, confident that the child had just gotten lost and thankfully had been found. Still, not everyone was on board with that explanation, or the dismissal of some of the things that Michael had said about his time in the woods. The Elizabethton Star reporting that some neighbors doubted the child actually had been alone for a week. Patricia said that her son told her someone had been with him on the mountain Friday night, but she didn't know who or why, and that he had seen his mother last Thursday near the campsite and called to her. Possibly describing the person who had been with him on the mountain the night before he was found, he said that he'd seen an old man getting drunk on Budweiser beer and a gallon of bourbon. Apparently, he did not seek this man's assistance because he was well trained not to talk to strangers, but I do think it's worth noting the specificity here, given that this is an 8-year-old boy. In addition to all of that, rescuer Taylor Bailey, who was with the crew that ultimately found Michael, said Michael had indicated he spent part of the week in a deserted cabin that was not searched. Superintendent Hatfield wasn't so sure and said he found it hard to believe that any cabins in the park had not been searched. On the other hand, it's possible that at the time the cabin Michael was speaking about was searched, Michael was not in the cabin. What really stuck out to me, however, was the issue of the sightings. Because in order for Chief Deputy Sellers to have been correct, Michael had to have followed a very specific path, and it would not have taken him to the rhododendron gardens. The family was staying near Twin Springs picnic area, and according to Sellers, the boy had walked down to a nearby creek to get water for his mother's coffee. Putting aside the contradictions with the reporting that said he was shooting a BB gun or going to get his BB gun or looking for his BBs or whatever, the closest stream to that picnic area is Tom's Branch. Thing is, Tom's Branch gets pretty close to that picnic area, and then it continues northwest down a slope for about half a mile before it begins to run parallel to Burbank Road. At no point during this time is that creek more than a quarter mile, that's less than half a kilometer, from Highway 143. Speaking of Highway 143, there is at least one report of a blonde-haired boy matching Michael's description walking up that road carrying a small pot. And when Michael was found by Steve Hopkins, Jimmy Doyle, and Taylor Bailey, he was carrying a small aluminum pot. The Charlotte Observer also referred to a sighting on Highway 261 near the top of Roan Mountain, but 261 is the North Carolina state number for the highway, and 143 is the Tennessee state number for the highway. So this could be the same sighting. Whether or not these are the same report, the important part is that it is a small blonde-haired boy near the top of Roan Mountain carrying a small pot. While there could be plenty of blonde-haired young boys along that road, the likelihood that you had 2 separate blonde-haired boys along that road with small pots is low. There's no campsites near the top of the mountain. And this, of course, lines up with reporting in other papers as well as the Charlotte Observer itself, which quoted Civil Air Patrol Major Randy Bowen as saying, "We had 3 confirmed sightings of the boy right here Sunday at the rhododendron gardens." Given those sightings and the fact that one of them even included the pot detail, it seems very likely that at some point on Sunday, July 3rd, 1983, Michael Reel was at the top of Roan Mountain. Or, at the very least, he was very close to it. If Michael was up there on Sunday, then it is downright impossible that he went from the picnic area to the stream, then followed the stream up to where he was eventually found. So why then did Chief Deputy Sellers say that that is what happened? Whatever the reason, the fact of the matter is that there is an incredible amount of weirdness going on here when all of the information is put together. First of all, the geography just makes so very little sense, and not just because the sightings conflict with what Sellers claimed Michael told him happened. If we assume that these sightings at the top of the mountain were legitimate, that would mean that the kid was either picked up and then dropped off at the top of the mountain, or he walked 6 miles up the mountain and then got lost in the gardens. Thing is, he was found 6 miles to the northeast of the rhododendron gardens, which means that he would have had to cross at least one highway to get there, no matter what route he took. If he found a highway, then he could have very easily found somebody to take him either back to his parents or to a law enforcement or park official. Now, we know he did not talk to strangers, but at the same time, one of the deputies in one of the articles that I read and then failed to actually write down because it just occurred to me now, said that he would have gotten into the car with anybody. Like, if somebody offered him a ride, he would have just gotten in. So now we have conflicting statements between the police and the parents. Some of the papers and some of the officials explain this away as him just being afraid of strangers, and that's why he didn't try and get anybody to help him. But when you look at how he was rescued, he was only found because he deliberately called out for help. In fact, he didn't even deliberately call out for help, he just called out, "Hey." Now, if we assume the sightings at the top of the mountain were not legitimate, then Michael still had to somehow make his way 2.5 miles north of his campsite, which meant skirting the base of Heaton Ridge. If that is what he did, then at no point was he more than 1/4 of a mile away from a major road or highway. And for the most part of that trek, he would have been within 100 yards of a road. Because of a large ridge that runs from the campsite at Twin Springs all the way to Heaton Ridge Road, where Michael was actually found, about 2 miles to the north, this route suggests that Michael was within a 1.25 square mile area the entire time. Had he been up on the ridge itself, then he was very much in the path of several search teams, and at any point he could have called out and asked for help. Either way, whether he did actually make it to the top of Roan Mountain, or if he just took that creek route down, if he was really on foot wandering through the forest this entire time, it is nearly impossible that he wasn't close to rescue at any given point. And if he was, it would seem he deliberately avoided it. In addition to the nonsensical geography of the issue, we have everything Michael himself said about the time that he had spent out there, most of which was just written off as confusion or hallucinations caused by hypothermia. Some of what he said seemed pretty reasonable, specifically that he had seen his mother near camp and called out for her, and that he had seen a man up on the mountain doing 2/3 of the George Thorogood special. One bourbon, one scotch, one beer. If his mother did recall this happening, then it wasn't mentioned in any of the newspapers, but the bigger question is why, if he was able to see the campsite, did he not just walk to it and end the whole ordeal right there? So far as I can tell looking at maps of the area, there really isn't any location from which he would have been able to see the campsite, but not get to it. It makes a bit more sense that Michael would not approach the man he saw getting drunk up on the mountain, but that brings up the question of how he was able to describe what that man was drinking in such great detail. What I mean by that is that it's not impossible that an 8-year-old would recognize the Budweiser label, but how did he know that the liquor was bourbon specifically? Unless he was deeply familiar with what different liquor bottles looked like at the time, he would have had to get pretty close to read the word bourbon. It could be reasonable that an 8-year-old could discern the difference between a bottle of Jim Beam and a bottle of Jack Daniels at 20 to 30 yards, but not if they have a good home life. But beyond these more reasonable claims about what he had seen while he was out there, we have the fact that he told investigators that he stayed with his grandfather in a white house, watching TV, and eating eggs and biscuits. This one is really hard to explain, even as a hallucination, because firmly believing you're inside of a white house with a television and eating meals with your grandfather, when in reality you're out in the middle of the woods, is a lot. Furthermore, according to the National Park Service, hypothermic hallucinations don't really occur until you're in the severe stage of the condition. While it is possible to recover from severe hypothermia, it is difficult to do that without help. And it's especially difficult to do it without help when you're an 8-year-old boy alone in the woods wearing nothing but a t-shirt and jeans. I do think it's also worth noting that Michael had never met either of his grandfathers. He did not know these men, he could not have described these men, he just didn't know them. The only person he might have recognized as a grandfather would have been Jimmy English, his grandmother's husband. Finally, while it could just be a simple issue of being a series of reporting errors, there are entirely too many versions of this story of how and when Michael Reel went missing for me to feel comfortable accepting any one of them. Looking at it, seeing that the papers were reporting his mother just telling a different story every single time, it does make me wonder if maybe somebody in Michael's family knew something about how he disappeared, and they just wouldn't let on. And whatever that thing would have been, and whatever reason they had for hiding it, it somehow managed to stay under wraps for 40 years. Now, I have absolutely zero evidence that there was any sort of familial involvement in Michael Reel going missing. But there are a couple of things that may be a little bit curious. For example, in one of the papers, it's escaping me which one right now, maybe I'll find a way to get it to Aiden to add in, to this part of the video later on, but in one of the papers, it's said that when Michael was found, his mother, said, "We've been looking for you," and he said, "I don't care," and then started crying. In another one of the papers, it's noted that Good Morning America wanted to have Michael come up to New York and tell his story on TV, but he and the family resisted this. His mother said something along the lines of, "We don't want a celebrity in the family." Basically, as soon as this whole ordeal was over, all his family wanted to do was get rid of it. Just, continue on living their lives as if it never happened. It could be that this was just a very traumatic incident and they wanted to move past it, didn't want to think about it, because it brought up bad memories. At the same time, if there were some strange familial foul play going on here, then the last thing you'd want to do as the perpetrator would be go and tell your story on Good Morning America, because that would give people the opportunity to pick it apart left and right. But like I said, beyond just a few weird statements, it really is the fact that the story of how Michael went missing changes so many times throughout this. I don't have anything to say that the parents had some sort of involvement, and even if they did, my take on it, looking at the situation, would be more that they felt guilty about being negligent, about not keeping an eye on him, than that they did anything to him on purpose. Honestly, what's really odd about the whole thing to me is the issue of law enforcement saying, "Oh no, he did this," when it seems pretty clear from the evidence that he did not do that. There are, of course, conspiratorial reasons to look at it and say, "Oh, they were covering it up," but at the same time, you have to remember that law enforcement agencies have PR teams, law enforcement agencies have reputations, and it doesn't look quite as bad to say, "Oh, we were just looking in the wrong place," as it does to say, "We missed this over and over again." Sometimes when a law enforcement agency or an investigative agency, covers something up, brushes it under the rug, makes it go away, it's not because they're trying to hide nefarious activity, but because they're trying to hide their own failures. I think a prime example of this is a case we looked at about a year ago, which was the disappearance and subsequent death of a young man named Todd Geib up in Michigan. Todd went missing after a party. The police did a search. They failed to find him. A lot of people said they failed to properly interview people who were at the party. And then 3 weeks later, his body turns up in a pond less than a quarter of a mile away from the party, and with zero decomposition. And they're like, "Oh, he must have been in there the whole 21 days. I guess he got drunk and drowned." Now, I won't go into all of the details about the Todd Geib case in this video. We have our video on that. I highly recommend watching it because I think it's a very interesting story, but I think it also gives a good idea of why this doesn't work, of why that law enforcement decision, why writing that off as an accidental drowning is extremely suspicious. Because Todd Geib's not the only time that's ever happened. Another case we looked at where something that was very obviously a murder was just dismissed as being an accidental drowning because the cops didn't want another unsolved murder on their hands was Tommy Booth down in Ridley. This was an extremely local case for us. We went down to the creek where his body was found. Basically, what was it, Aiden? It was like 16 years to the day, something like that. Yeah, it was like almost to the day of when he went missing over a decade later. Near 9 years. It was 9 years. So yeah, it was, I think, 9 years to the day after he went missing, we went to that same spot. In this case, we have the case files. I have the manila folder of everything that his family was given when they requested it. That kid did not drown. At least he did not drown accidentally. So my point in saying that, my point in bringing these two more recent cases up, is that sometimes the police aren't covering up Bigfoot. They're just covering up their own laziness or inability to solve a crime. That's not to say that every single time a police department fails to solve a crime, it's because they're lazy or incompetent. There are plenty of crimes that are just really hard to solve. But on some occasions, you do see law enforcement giving up because it looks better to say it was an accident than to say we couldn't solve it. Now, all of that said, while it's easy to criticize Chief Deputy Sellers for kind of hand-waving away what, in my opinion, is a pretty major contradiction here in the story, that's not going to solve the case. That's not going to explain what happened here. I mean, let's look at the explanation for what happened here. In order for these to have been hallucinations, then he had to have been hypothermic, but he had to have been severely hypothermic. And if he was severely hypothermic, that means that his body temperature was getting down, I think, into the high 80s for degrees Fahrenheit. If he's at that point, it means that he is in a bad way, and he's probably not going to recover from that on his own without assistance. But in order for him to get to that severe level of hypothermia, well, you would expect that that would have happened while he was up on top of the mountain, not when he was at the base where it was much warmer. Even if it had happened at the base where he was much warmer, did it happen after he had gotten all the way to Heaton Ridge Road? And then, if so, what happened next? Was him saying he was in a deserted cabin, him actually being in a deserted cabin, but suffering from hallucinations that made him think that there were people in the cabin? Is it possible that some of the berries he ate or one of the apples he ate contains some sort of toxin that caused him to hallucinate? Because that would explain a lot that the hypothermia wouldn't. Because if he got to the point of hypothermia where he was hallucinating, it's not remotely likely he's going to survive. I mean, I'm sure you can tell just watching the video that as I'm trying to process this, because I've been working on this for days, trying to figure out what happened here. And like I said, there's a bunch of things that I'm like, okay, maybe that works, but not all put together. The official explanation, in my opinion, does not make sense. There's just too many contradictions, too many sightings in one place. The issue of hypothermia really is sticking with me. I'm not sure how that works. At the end of the day, I just cannot wrap my head around why he went from his campsite up the road to the top of the mountain. If he was picked up, that explains how he got there, but why'd he get in the car with somebody? But he got up there, he gets to the top of Roan Mountain, he runs around to the rhododendron bushes, says something to his dad, but then refuses to come out, then proceeds to go back down the mountain, another several miles to the northeast, and just hang out in a field until he sees people and he calls out, hey. He's afraid of strangers to the extent that he won't come out of the rhododendron garden, but he's not afraid of strangers to the extent that he'll get in a car with one. And he called out to his mom because he saw her, he knew where the campsite was, and he wanted to not be lost anymore, and then proceeded to get more lost. I mean, let's also rework that bit in, because this just occurred to me. If he did what Chief Deputy Sellers said he did, then how was he in a position to see his mother on Thursday night? If he went down the creek, all the way, followed it to Heaton Ridge Road, and then went into the woods there, how was he in a position days later to be back at the campsite? And if he came back to the campsite on Thursday night, then why did he spend all of Friday working his way back away from it? It's one thing to say that he was afraid of strangers so he didn't ask for help. It's another thing to say that he was within range of his family and then left. And I actually want to bring this back to what he said when he was found. Because according to Jimmy Doyle and the others there, they asked him, how long have you been in the woods? And he replied, 30 minutes. That was written off as confusion. Oh, he's hypothermic, he's weak, he's delirious from not eating. He doesn't know how long he's been in the woods. But I think it is also worth considering that he was telling the truth. You know, even after he'd been warmed up and fed, he was telling people he had spent time with his grandfather. And they said, oh, well, you hallucinated that. Hallucinations can be retained as real memories that make you think it actually happened. Okay, we got this, we understand what's going on here. But consider the possibility that when they asked him, how long have you been in the woods, he said about 30 minutes, because 30 minutes ago, he wasn't in the woods. There are a number of houses in this area. There are cabins, there are abandoned cabins. And if you think about what was described here, is it not possible that he was in fact brought into somebody's home and that in his, starving state, he just comprehended this person as being his grandfather? Is it possible that when he said he stayed with his grandfather, he meant Jimmy English, his step-grandfather? Because one article suggests that Jimmy English was there. The other articles say that it was just the mother, the grandmother, and the sisters. Could somebody have let it slip accidentally? that Jimmy was in fact there and that Jimmy was the last person to see him? Could Jimmy have taken him somewhere for some reason? Of course, if we do try to chase down that angle, then we come to the question of why did Jimmy do this, and I don't have an answer. And you've probably heard me say on a number of occasions, if you're not new to this channel, that motive is important and that you shouldn't just assume something because it could have happened. There has to be a reason behind it happening for you to consider it as an option. And I don't have a reason that Jimmy English would do this, and I don't have a reason why, if he did, it would never come up again. The only reason I can think that somebody would kidnap a child for a period of a few days and then return them is unfortunately very dark. It also would explain the lack of concrete memories, because when something traumatic happens to a child, their brain often finds a way to cover it up or twist it into something that is more conceivable and less painful. But like I said, I have absolutely no evidence to suggest that Jimmy did anything of the sort to his step-grandson. You know, in my experience with having step-grandparents on both sides of my family, they have been wonderful. They have been loving. They have treated me like their own flesh and blood. So I don't want anybody to look at this and be like, oh, well, he was a step-grandfather, because that did happen with our Sebastian Rogers videos. And, you know, I am a child of step-parents. My step-parents love me very much. They treated me no differently from their biological children. So I think a lot of people have this concept that when somebody is not a biological family member, they are, you know, they should be viewed with suspicion. And I don't think that's necessarily the truth. So, looking at the mundane possibilities here, I don't see enough evidence to come to any singular conclusion. Maybe somebody knows something, maybe somebody hid it for years, and there's just a piece of information out there that's missing, and therefore this case will never be solved. But like I said, it doesn't make sense to me that the official narrative is what happened, and if the official narrative is not what happened, then in my opinion, this case remains unsolved. You're probably going to find people out there who will say it was Bigfoot took the kid. I mean, look, we have all these stories of children being abducted and then cared for by some sort of being that they identify as a bear, a gorilla. I've seen robot grandma. Not kidding, by the way. That's a Mount Shasta one. Honestly, you know, flesh and blood grandpa would be a less weird thing to say. But in most cases, these suggestions are that somebody has been kidnapped by Sasquatch or perhaps some kind of feral people. Now, this is down in Tennessee, where we have been told numerous times by numerous local residents about the tree people or the tree knockers, who are known to sometimes take children and care for them. Would the tree knockers, the tree people, have television sets? I don't think so. They probably would have eggs and biscuits, but I don't think that they would have television sets. But if I'm going to be completely honest, if we're going to look at the paranormal aspect of things, I would lean away from Bigfoot here and into Celtic mythology. You see, the Celts, specifically the Gaels, the Irish, had this concept of the Sidhe or the Seath, and this was a fairy mound. It was a place where frequently you would go underground, and going underground would take you into something of an alternate dimension, a parallel realm. Now, in the Christianized versions of the stories, this is the otherworld, which gets compared more to like an underworld concept, because the Christian writers of the time were more familiar with the Greco-Roman religious beliefs. So when they described this, they saw it more as an otherworld, but further study, as an underworld, but further study later on has led to a belief in something more akin to little pocket dimensions, where you would go through the fairy mound and you would find yourself in the domain of one of the Fae, one of the Tuatha. These domains would often be depicted as anything from a cabin in the woods to a small, fief, just in a sort of parallel world. Oftentimes you have mentions of castles or fortresses and homes, and there were all of these hospitality rules with the Tuatha. We also have the Celtic stories of changelings that are basically fake humans that are left behind when the fairies steal a baby. You would typically know that you had a changeling because it wouldn't behave like a normal child. It would be quiet, it might have stunted growth, it might not respond to stimuli properly. Today, a lot of people believe that what was really going on with quote-unquote changelings is that they were kids with various forms of autism. But because people didn't understand the concept of neurological disorders, they just saw it as, oh, my child was clearly taken by the fairies. The reason I bring this up is because the geography of the Appalachians and the cultural background of the Appalachians is Celtic. The Appalachians were once part of the same mountain range that now runs through Scotland. We know that culturally there was a lot of intermingling between the Cherokee and the Celtic peoples, the Scottish, the Irish, and the Welsh, because their clan systems matched up very nicely. So, of course, all of this made me think about the possibility, if we'll put it that way, that Michael found his way up into that rhododendron garden, went into a bit of a hole in the ground, found himself in a fairy mound, experienced being at a cabin with his deceased grandfather, or a house with his deceased grandfather, watched TV, ate some eggs, and then when it was time to come home, he walked right back out into the regular world. But because of the way that fairy mounds work and the way that Celtic mythology works, he didn't find himself in exactly the same place that he went in, and therefore, about 30 minutes. Take that as you will. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying it's kind of fun to think about. This is one of those cases where the kid was found, he was perfectly fine, and he's okay decades later, so far as I'm aware. So I feel a little bit more comfortable being imaginative, willing to explore other possibilities. I will say, if you find the whole Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fae and all of that stuff interesting, highly recommend checking out our videos, Halloween Isn't What You Think It Is from last year, and also, God, what is the video called? It's the Banshee video. Oh, it's bad.
Yeah.
It's like Celtic Mommy Goddesses and the Wailing Fairies of Death.
That's the exact...
Is that the exact title?
That's the exact title.
It's Celtic Mommy Goddesses and the Wailing Fairies of Death. We were a smaller channel at the time. I believe that was almost 2 years ago. Anyway, there's a few other videos on our channel that have some Celtic mythology, some Celtic lore in them. I think the Tartaria videos, and a number of others. Personally, I find that stuff fascinating, but it does not do well on this channel, so we don't touch on it very much. So I know, got a little bit less structured toward the end of the video here than we usually do, but to be honest, I only had 2 days to write this video and do all of the research, so I'm fried. I did not have time to write down and properly... Is there a verb form of coherent? I don't think there is. Coherentize my notes.
Cohesively reorganize your notes.
There we go. Cohesively reorganize my notes. So all of that said, my point is, this was a weird one. It wasn't weird in the sense that it immediately seemed supernatural, or that there is no conceivable explanation. It's more weird in the sense that the people who were there don't seem to have questioned obvious contradictions. I get it to some extent, you found the kid, nothing else really matters here because the kid didn't mention being kidnapped, and him being kidnapped is not the only way this could have happened. So it's, enough to say, all right, we found the kid, everybody's happy, everybody's home, everybody's healthy, that's it, case closed, we're done. Thing is, immediately after this all happened, another person went missing in the same spot. Or at least, that is what David Paulides says about Larry Davenport. Now, we will be getting to Larry Davenport's story in the episode following this one. So if you're just seeing this video the first week it was out, that video is not up yet. If you're seeing this video more than a week after it came out, go check out our video on Larry Davenport. We will link it in the description. And if you would like to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, then the most direct way you can do it is with a $1 subscription to either our Patreon or our YouTube channel right here. That gets you access to our monthly Liquored Lore episodes. That is our take on drunk folklore, where Aiden and I have a few beverages and then talk about something silly that happened in the past, or some sort of folktale, or even some of the cases we've gone over. I will say this doesn't matter for the $1 tier, but if you go over to Patreon, the higher tiers do come with gifts. So after 3 consecutive months of subscription, you will get something like a t-shirt or a hoodie at the higher tiers, a poster, a mug, something along those lines. Essentially, Patreon is the better value for you. If you would like to support us in a way that you get to consume something, well, we have coffee. It's from Tableau Roasting Company. It is linked in the description as well, or you can go to tableauroastingco.com. I designed it myself. I had I wouldn't say almost a decade, but over a half decade of experience as a barista in artisan roasteries. I know my coffee. I was literally the product of my father meeting my mother in the cafe he owned. Coffee might as well be in my blood, but right now it's definitely in my system. If you don't want to consume the lodge, but you would like to wear the lodge, feel as though you're in our skin, you can do so by going to bunkerbranding.com and just buying our merch. I wear it a lot in the videos. We have a few separate designs. Hopefully Aiden will remember to put them on screen in the editing process, but if he doesn't, well, you can imagine. As always, the best way to stay up to date on what is going on here at the channel is through our Discord. You can get there by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge. We also have several other channels. They don't get content quite as frequently as this one, but we are working on ramping that up as things become a little bit more stable here at the main channel. The next most frequently updated channel we have is the Weird Bible Podcast. It is the Weird Bible channel. That is something that we do with Wendigoon, and soon we're going to have a few other projects going on that channel. That is all about the Bible, but it is not a show or a channel just for Christians. It is a show about Christianity. So if you find yourself interested in religion and mythology in general, just as a topic, it is for you as much as it is for the Christians who are trying to better understand their own faith. We also have my personal channel, which is Aiden Mattis. That is a mixture of gaming and commentary and music stuff. It's a little bit more of a, it's a lot less structured as a channel, but we had something really cool happen last week, which was I streamed Space Marine 2, the new Warhammer 40k game. I've never played Warhammer anything before except for, or Warhammer 40k anything, but I played the fantasy version on Total War. But my point is, we hit 1,000 viewers on a gaming stream when I don't think we've ever hit more than 300. So that was really cool. I'm going to be playing a little bit more of that game, going to be playing through the operations, doing some multiplayer. Then probably when Black Ops 6 comes out, I'm going to switch over to that and play some Warzone. And we'll just kind of keep rolling. As games come out, we'll try them, and we'll show you the campaigns and everything, and hopefully have a good time. Also, the Friday streams, we drink. So if you want to see what I'm like a little silly, it's a great opportunity. We also have the History Hut, which, again, podcast is in the works, channel content is in the works. There's a cool concept we have for that coming up. We'll see how it launches, but I'm excited about it. And then, of course, we also have our 2 new channels under new hosts that are just part of our network. Those are Off the Record, hosted by Luke Eccles, and Boozy Mixologist, hosted by our buddy Celso, who is probably the best bartender I've ever met. Off the Record, of course, is what you would expect. It is a channel about music, featuring interviews and lore and things like that about the music industry. Finally, the very last thing I'd like to bring up, because it's probably the thing that most of you already know about, is our podcast. It is live Monday nights at 7, no longer Sunday nights, it's Monday nights now. We wanted weekends back, guys, I'm sorry. We haven't had weekends in like 3 years, it was weekend time. But point is, that goes live 7 p.m. Eastern time on Mondays. If it's not going to, we will give you an update on the community page beforehand. Make sure you've got those community posts and your notifications all turned on so that you actually get those updates. Once again, you can also get them via Discord. If you can catch the show live, we do a Q&A session at the end of every episode using Super Chats. We use the Super Chats because that is the easiest way to keep track of your questions. If it's a $2 Super Chat, we will answer it just the same as a $20. If you can't catch the podcast live, then you can always catch it on video on demand right here on YouTube, or you can catch it as an audio and a video, actually, on Spotify, and as an audio, I believe, basically everywhere else. Aiden's nodding his head in the corner to tell me I'm right. Last but not least, I would like to thank our sponsor for this video, Delete Me. They've done several sponsorships with us in the past few months. We've liked working with them. We think they provide a really good, solid service. And if you'd like to try it for yourself, you can go to joindeleteme.com/LoreLodge, use code LoreLodge, and that will get you 20% off all U.S. consumer plans. With all of that said and out of the way, I am Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.